we've got people trickling in here. We've brought everybody in from the waiting room. Just want to thank everybody for showing up here tonight. JJ Gladden with Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. I will serve as our host tonight. As people keep coming in from the waiting room, give you a little bit of the format of how this will work. We'll have 3 panelists tonight, and we will do questions at the end. But as you have questions, just go ahead and type those into the chat. We're going to take all of our questions through the chat tonight. Instead of having people unmute and ask their question live, we're just going to keep track of everything in the chat. That way, if we see something as we're presenting that just keeps coming up and it's maybe something we need to spend a little bit more time on, it'll give us that idea real fast, and we'll go ahead and pivot and start talking about that and incorporate it into our presentation. So it looks like we've got most of our people in here. So I'll introduce myself again. JJ Gladden with Arkansas Game and Fish Commission. I work in education, and I'm part of the fishing education team. And tonight we're going to do part 1 of a 2-part series on farm pond management. Tonight we're going to talk more about the pond itself, the water, fish, stocking rates, things like that. And we're going to save the vegetation portion of the conversation for our second part, which will be September 6th. That is the day after Labor Day. So if there's a lot of questions about vegetation, we'll touch on it, but we really we want everybody to come back for that second part of the series so that we can spend as much time on questions about fish, water, ponds, things like that as we can tonight. So let's go ahead and introduce our panel. We'll say our names and like a little 30 seconds about what we do, who we do it for, things like that. So let's start with Micah Tyndall.
Hey, how's it going, guys? My name is Micah Tyndall. I am the Assistant District Fisheries Biologist, and I work out of the East Central office, which is based out of Brinkley. We actually cover Pulaski County all the way to the Mississippi River. We've got 10 counties, and our primary job is to go through and to sample the reservoirs and the rivers that are in our district, and of course provide management recommendations for those systems going forward. But we do field pond calls on the side, and I'll talk more about that after a bit.
Perfect. Thank you, Micah. Scott Jones, go ahead and
introduce
yourself.
I'm the Small Impoundment Extension Specialist out of UA Pine Bluff. So my responsibility is helping the county extension agents handle pond cases. So if you need boots on the ground, somebody at the pond real quick, you can call your county agents and they can usually respond fairly quickly. And if they are not able to handle your issue, or if it's too complicated, they will reach me and I will get out there as quickly as I can. We do site visits. We diagnose everything from water chemistry issues to vegetation, fish issues, fish kills, just about anything there is to deal with ponds. We try our best to help. So I'm stationed out of UAPB, but I do have a statewide responsibility.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. And live here from Lone Oak with me is Chad Wicker.
Chad Wicker. I'm the Assistant Hatchery Manager at the Joe Hogan State Fish Hatchery here in Lone Oak. Our primary job is to raise and stock game fish and bait fish throughout the state per our district biologist request. So that's basically what we do. We also do a lot of maintenance on our own ponds. We have 77 ponds here at the hatchery that we have to maintain and do the upkeep on. So we have quite a bit of experience in small pond management and reconstruction, things like that.
Thank you, sir. So we've still got a few people coming in, but we're going to go ahead and get this thing into the meat of the matter. And we're going to start with Micah talking a little bit about a little bit more in depth about Game and Fish's role in pond management, the services that we provide to the public. And I'm not going to steal any more of your thunder, Micah. So Go for it, buddy.
Sounds good, JJ. I appreciate it. First thing I want to start with, if JJ, if you can share that image for us. One of the first things that we recommend is, we enjoy helping folks, especially when it comes to farm pond management. We know it provides a lot of opportunity for folks often in their backyard. This is just a map of the state of Arkansas, and you can see how the districts are broken up. And these are the folks that you want to reach out to. You can call our Little Rock office and get to the fisheries department, and they can send your call out to us, but it's a whole lot easier on those, the ladies and the guys there in the office in Little Rock, if you can just pick up the phone and call our local offices. If you're not able to find this, it's the same image is actually in our guidebook on page 3. Very simple, got all the counties broken out, and you can call the folks that are directly responsible for your counties and be the ones that'll be helping you. So that's one of the first things I wanted to say is don't be afraid to reach out to us. And there are specific folks that cover specific regions, and we try to handle stuff within our own area because we're most familiar with the conditions that are going on in our district. So we do field a lot of calls regarding fish management, especially on people's small reservoirs and ponds. We get a lot of different types of questions. One of the ones we talk a lot about is pond construction, and specifically we defer a lot of that to NRCS and some of the soil conservation work that they do. And I think JJ will talk about, or Chad will talk about some of that stuff as far as design goes. We can go through and give you recommendations on, water depths that you might want to put in your pond, maybe some peninsulas or islands that you would put in to increase the amount of shoreline. Shoreline increases productivity. And so anytime you can make more shore, you're going to have better fishing opportunities. We do make recommendations for fish habitat structures if folks have questions about those. And we can even give some pretty basic guidance on installing spawning beds if those are issues that you have concerning your systems. We do occasionally field calls about fertilization. There are some folks that choose to fertilize for various reasons, either to maybe shade the water out to prevent aquatic vegetation growth or to increase the productivity of their pond. And there are folks that ask questions about setting up feeding programs on their ponds as well, and we can deal with that. Some of the biggest questions I think we probably deal with is what to stock and what not to stock. And I think the first question we usually ask is, what do you want to do with your pond? What's going to be an ideal situation? Are you somebody who wants to catch a bunch of fish often? Or are you interested in taking the grandkids down or your kids down where they can catch a bunch of big brim and a bunch of bass in a hurry and keep them interested? Or are you somebody that's really interested in trophy bass management? And those are really two different scenarios, and we would give you advice other directions. And of course, there's other options about crappie fishing in ponds, hybrid brim options, and catfish options as well that we're happy to talk about. If you are going to call us, there's some pretty basic things you can do. One, if you have questions that relate to certain things, we do field a few calls on vegetation every now and then. We typically defer those to other folks, but if you do have a specific question about vegetation, take good pictures. And that's one of the beauties of technology is most folks have really nice smartphones, can take really high quality images, and that really helps us if we're going to help you be able to ID things. Also, catch records. If you are curious about what to do with your pond, we really advise a 6-month catch record. Basically, every time you go out, keep track of what you're catching. And if you can go through and figure out what sizes and keep up with these things, numbers and sizes are really going to help us give you some advice going forward on your management. A couple of just misconceptions. We talked about a couple of things before we started this today. And one of the things that we're dealing with right now is it's hot. And I think we're all pretty well aware of that. And there are some folks that are having some oxygen kills. A lot of folks will call and say, well, my pond is turning over. Well, for the most part, this time of year, ponds don't actually turn over. And a lot of our ponds aren't deep enough to turn over. So most of those issues are dissolved oxygen related. To that, we just reply, you've got to do everything you can do to get some aeration in that system to provide some oxygen. There's a lot of out-of-the-box ideas. I know folks that have backed bush hogs in to stir the water to help make sure you're getting oxygen. There are folks that have either relift systems or well, and you can stack a bunch of pallets underneath your water that's coming in and really help break it up and get your oxygen up that way. I even know folks that will take a boat motor and basically beach it and kick the motor up real high and just let it turn. Anytime you're seeing white mixing in, you're mixing in oxygen. So this time of year, pretty common misconception that we deal with, and not turning over, you've just got some oxygen issues, and those are some quick ways that you can address those. Had a phone call from a guy the other day, and he had fish at the surface. Kind of looked like they were gasping for air. Very much a very classic example of what fish do when they begin to have oxygen issues. Also want to talk a little bit, we do have some bait fish regulations that have gone into place, and those have pretty wide range implications for farm ponds in the sense that we're not allowed to transport bait anymore. So used to, a lot of folks would go out and you would grab some sunfish from your pond and you would go fish somewhere, and that's no longer legal. You have to fish with the bait that's caught within the system that you're in. And we say that because on the pond management side, you really don't need to be bringing things into your pond. It's not a good idea. I know a lot of folks over time will try to bring bigger bass in. It's not legal, and two, you can actually manage your pond to get there. So sometimes you want to put a 10-pound bass in so you can catch a 10-pound bass, but if you be patient with a couple of years and some proper management, intensive management, you can very much get there on your own. And after that, I think I'll turn it over back to JJ and let Chad talk for a little bit.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Yeah, there's a lot of good information in there. And I just want to remind you, I think the sharing of the map was a great resource. And there's no way that this group is going to be able to talk about everything there is to know about farm pond management in the hour that we have. So just briefly going over things, talking more about what each individual's responsibilities are and sharing the resources so people can, follow up, find these names, contact people in their area, things like that. I mean, that's a perfect way of handling this because, if we try to deal with everything at a statewide level, we're just going to get bogged down and we're not going to be able to help anybody. But we get it broken down into those districts and we can really help people find the resources that are going to help them have success in their property. So thank you, Micah. That was great. All right. So I'm going to let Wicker talk for a few minutes about more of the pond design construction part because he's done so much of that here at the hatchery. We've been through a major renovation here over the last, I'm going to say 10 years, and he's been a big part of that. So I won't steal any more of his thunder on that.
All right, thanks, JJ. I think when considering pond construction, probably the first thing we need to look at is your soil types. You don't want to build a pond and then have all the water leach out of it. So like was said earlier, get in touch with your county agent or your NRCS person, and they can come out and do some soil test, see what your compaction rate's going to be, see what your substrate's going to be, and how well that you should be able to hold water so that once you put the money and time and effort into building a pond, that you're going to be able to sustain water in that pond. The next thing to consider, very important key, is the water source. I mean, where's your water going to come from? Are you planning on just catching rainwater? How big's your watershed area? Is it going to be able to handle that? Another deal that the NRCS people or county agent folks can help you with. If you're planning on using well water, you have a little bit more sustainable source to come from with that. And that helps out a bunch, especially like Micah talked about earlier when you get hot summertime, water temps get way up, you can add well water in there to keep that pond cooled off. There in turn, it helps the oxygen in your pond as well and helps your fish be able to survive during these hot summer days and nights. Another water source that you might use if you have access to a canal ditch or something like that, you could supplement water into your pond if it gets low throughout the summer months when we're not getting any rain, things like that. So just be thinking about that. Once you figure out your soil types, what's your water source going to be? Because if you're just dependent on rainwater, you may lose some fish in your pond because you won't be able to sustain the appropriate amount of water that you need to keep fish alive. Next thing I guess to consider would be the size, the availability of the area you have. This goes back to watershed. If you're dependent on rainwater, how big do you want to make? You want to make your area? There's certain limits you can make without having to get permits. I think the levee height, anything over 25 feet, you have to have permitted. So you get down in the weeds pretty quickly with that kind of stuff. Another thing is your depth. You know, you want it to be deep enough that you can sustain some low water events, that you can have a deep pool in it. But like Micah alluded to earlier, you want as much shoreline area as you can have as well, because that's where all your spawning activities, your bloom production, all of that stuff is going to come from your shallower areas in your pond. So you need a diverse, I guess, diverse depths, many different depths and structures that you can add to your pond always helps with that kind of stuff. And getting into structures, there's lots of things you can add to help fish productivity. You know, there's people sink trees, they put in artificial structures with PVC pipes, things like that. Micah can help with that. We can help with that. Just give us a call. We can kind of show you what we use in our lakes and some of our reservoirs as well. The next thing, I guess, to consider is what is your pond going to be used for? Are you going to use it for recreation? Are you going to use it for recreation / livestock / irrigation? I mean, there's several different uses. Once you construct a pond, there's several different uses that it can be utilized for. So all of that determines on your pond construction, your size, your water source. So those are just some things to think about when you're in the process of your initial process of building a pond, constructing a pond. So, and then we'll get into the vegetation and things like that on section 2. So I'll just kind of leave it at that and just mull that over. If you have any questions, type them in the chat. We'll answer them as best we can. Thanks.
Perfect. Thank you, sir. Yeah, there are a lot of good points, and we've got a few questions in the chat about water testing and natural watersheds, and we will definitely circle back to those when we get to the Q&A. But that's why we're doing all the questions in the chat, so we have a list of those so that we don't lose anything. So at this point, let's go to Scott, and he's got a little slideshow put together for us on some of the things that he talks to people about when he's dealing with this topic. So all you.
All right. So we are full screen. You see the slides now? Good. Here we go. So I've got way more to cover than what can be done in a short amount of time. So I'm going to talk for a little bit about fish that are suitable for ponds in Arkansas, some that are kind of risky, and then some that you ought to avoid. And if I'm doing really good and we're moving quick, I might go a little bit into some assessment and management stuff. We'll just see how things are going. So to start off, we'll talk about fish species that are suitable for Arkansas. Largemouth bass are typically our primary sport fish. They're the #1 most popular sport fish in Arkansas. They do really well in our ponds. There are 4 varieties that are available. Your native northern strain largemouth are the one that are naturally found in Arkansas. They are great for our climate. They work well in ponds, but they don't grow quite as large or as fast as Florida strain largemouth bass. The trouble with Florida strains is that central to northern Arkansas is really about the limit of their thermal tolerance for cold. So even in Arkansas, if you stock one of these wonderful Florida bass in northern Arkansas, they very well may not grow any faster or bigger than our native northern strain bass would, and the Floridas are more cranky in terms of weather patterns. There are hybrid varieties available. It's a cross between a Florida and a northern strain. These can grow faster and bigger than either species by themselves, but they also have some drawbacks in terms of reproduction and also growth especially in northern parts of the state. There are also feed-trained bass if you want to feed your bass pellets and you don't want to deal with maintaining fertility, maintaining forage fish populations. That is an option. It can be fun, but we don't run into that just a whole bunch, but it's something that you can look into. You hear red ear sunfish mentioned quite a lot in pond stocking recommendations. So the benefit of these dudes is that they eat snails. And snails are intermediate hosts for parasites that can get into the fins and fillets of your fish. So if you stock these guys at 100 to about 250 fish per acre, they're going to help keep those parasites out of your fish. They'll be happier and your fillets will look a lot cleaner when you decide to harvest. So bluegills tend to be our primary forage fish for ponds. So they do really well in the pond environment. They eat insects and insect larvae. They spawn multiple times during the summer. There are two reproducing varieties of bluegills, your native northern strain bluegills that you can find naturally here in Arkansas. There are also copper-nosed bluegills that are kind of like a Florida strain bluegill. They're native to the southeastern U.S. They grow a little bit faster, a little bit bigger, and they've got cool coloration. They're an option. There are also hybrid bluegills that work really well in small ponds. We're talking like half an acre to a quarter acre or smaller, little bitty tiny ones, where reproduction and population balances are tough to keep in order. The trouble with hybrids is their reproduction is not completely zero. And what will often happen in 5 to 6 years or so, you'll start seeing the average size and production of your bluegill start to go down. So they typically need to be renovated every 5 to 10 years or so. But for a short amount of time, hybrid bluegills grow real fast, real big, and can be a lot of fun. You just have to know that it will decline eventually. Now, channel catfish are a really hardy species native to the Mississippi River drainage. They are hardy. They eat just about anything, and they can handle water chemistry and characteristics that a lot of our other sport fish cannot. So especially if you have muddy water, really hot water, we're talking about especially livestock watering tanks are a really specific situation where these guys work really well compared to other fish. They don't need to see where to go to find their food. They feed primarily by scent and taste. So if they cannot see, they're able to feed just fine, while our bass and our bluegills and our crappies can't eat very well because they're very visual feeders. Now, forage minnows, we have two varieties that are available widely in Arkansas, the fathead minnow and the golden shiner. So the fathead minnow is a little fish, 2 to 4 inches, about as big as they get. The golden shiner gets larger. They can get 6 inches or larger. And these two guys are typically recommended as an initial forage fish for brand new or recently renovated ponds that are getting stocked fresh. So the idea is to create a diverse forage base for your bass, for your crappies, for your catfish, if you decide to stock those. And getting these guys in there early can help provide that. The drawback to these guys is that they are terrible at getting away from largemouth bass. So after about a year or so, after largemouth bass have been introduced, you will not find your shiners, you will not find your minnows, unless you have a very high abundance of cover and spawning habitat specifically for the shiners. For that reason, I have stopped recommending either of these fish for supplemental feeding because they are very expensive in terms of food fish. They're about $30 per pound, and they are eliminated very quickly. So there are other fish that you can stock that are far better in terms of the cost and more likely to persist and provide more long-term benefit to your bass than either of these guys. But in the right situation, they are helpful. Now, grass carp are commonly recommended as a vegetation control option. They're part of the standard stocking recommendations to the Extension Service because of their vegetation prevention. They are now required in Arkansas to be triploid. So they have to be triploid to stock in Arkansas. They do well on some plants, especially hydrilla, some of the naiads, and fanwort. They will eat, but don't do great at coontail and some of the pondweed species. And generally for these non-preferred species, they will still work. You just have to stock more of them. So as a preventative measure, we're typically talking 3 to 5 grass carp per acre as a preventative measure. But if you have a vegetation problem, it's usually going to take 15 to 20 grass carp per acre to get that under control. And it's also probably going to take 2 years for them to get it under control if they do. Now, going into some risky options, crappie are extremely popular. They're, depending on the state, they are number 2 or number 3 most popular sport fish, and a lot of people want them in their ponds. It can be done, but it is extremely risky, and more times than not, eventually it will lead to the failure of the pond, especially in ponds that are smaller than 50 acres. That's kind of a small lake, but even as small as 25 and less, they definitely cause more trouble than they're worth in a lot of cases. Now, there are 3 varieties available: white crappie, black crappie, and hybrid. Typically, the black crappie are going to be the species that is recommended for ponds because they are better suited for that environment. They will eat insects and insect larvae at a higher rate than the white crappie will, and their reproduction is a little bit more stable. The biggest trouble with crappie is that their reproduction is inconsistent. So they may go a year, 2, 3 years without reproducing at all. And then one year, when everything lines up just right, they will have a gigantic spawn with bazillions of little bitty tiny fish, all of the same size. And what happens is all of those tiny fish at the same size exhaust the food source, exhaust the resources that are necessary to grow those little fishes to bigger ones. And not only the crappie are stunted and slow growing, it also cripples your bluegills, it cripples your bass, and all of the other fish that need resources that are appropriate for that size of fish. Now, you can make crappie work if you have a very diverse forage base. So we're talking the golden shiners. If you have a pond that's supporting a good population of threadfin shad, and you have good habitat for your forage and your sport fish, and you also have a pretty healthy largemouth bass population to manage the crappie once they have one of those boom spawn cycles, you can make crappie work. But even in those cases, sometimes things get out of whack, and in more often than not, the eventual fate of a 25 to 50 acre or smaller pond or a lake that has crappie stocked into it, it eventually will fail and it has to be drained and restocked, especially when you get into less than 25 acres, 10 acres and smaller. It can work for a short amount of time, but it's more than likely eventually going to fail. If you're okay with that and you're okay with restocking whenever this blows up, okay. Now, hybrid crappie are becoming more available. They're not widely available, but they're starting to get there. These are probably going to be more appropriate for the smaller pond. There's not much research on them yet. We're hoping to get more info on it, but if you want to try hybrids in a small pond, give us a call and we'll walk you through what you can do to try to make it work. Now, the shads. There are 2 species of shad in Arkansas, the threadfin and the gizzards. Threadfin are actually an excellent forage fish. They get to about 6 inches in length. They can be very abundant in a fertile pond, which provides lots and lots of food for your crappies and your bass, and even your catfish. They are a pelagic fish, so they swim around in open water, feeding on plankton, while your bass and your crappies and your bluegills typically like to hang around closer to the bank and be associated with cover. Your threadfins will swim around in open water. The gizzards will do that too. Now, the trouble with threadfins is that they are cold sensitive. When the water gets into the mid 40s, they start getting a little bit huffy and puffy. When it starts getting into the low 40s, they struggle. If it gets into the 30s, a lot of times they're going to start dying pretty hard. Now, most threadfin in Arkansas are kind of adapted to our climate. If there is a gradual cool off, a lot of times our threadfins will survive the pond environment over winter. But if we have a really dramatic drop from 50 degrees to the low 40s in a couple of days, we're going to lose a lot of threadfin. So you'll need to check after the winter to see if they've survived, and if not, restock them sometime in April and get them in there before they're spawning, which should happen in late May. Now, the gizzards are a good forage fish in certain situations. The trouble with gizzards is they can get really big. So gizzards can go 12 inches or so in length, and that's way bigger than any pond bass in Arkansas is going to be able to eat in most situations. But if you are into trophy bass and you already have a good mature bass population established, and we're in the I'm growing 7 to 8 pound bass, things are good, but I want to go 10 pounds or bigger, you can start looking into gizzard shads as a big extra large forage option. But just know, if they start outgrowing the mouths of your bass, what the end fate a lot of times with gizzards is you'll get a really large biomass of 10 to 12-inch gizzard shad that can't be eaten by anything in your pond, and they are cropping off your plankton that supports all of your other fish. So what will often happen is the gizzard shad kind of collapse the fishery from the bottom up. So they can work, but it's got to be a very specific situation. Other sport fish that you can consider in specific situations, hybrid striped bass are underutilized as a sport fish in Arkansas, partly because they require a little bit harder water, more calcium than what our other fish can tolerate, and they're just not as popular. So the deal with hybrid striped bass, they are pelagic fish too. So they swim around in open water, eating primarily shad, but they will also eat fish feed. So if you want to have a really aggressive schooling, top water eating, fast fighting or fast hearting, fast swimming fish, and you've got open water that's fertile and fairly deep, you can actually support hybrid striped bass fairly well. Now, smallmouth bass in most of Arkansas are not going to work in ponds because they require clearer water, cleaner water, cooler water, and typically deeper ponds. In North Arkansas, there's some places where it can work. In most of our swampy, shallow, vegetation infested central and southern Arkansas ponds, the smallmouth probably will not. Now, some species that we need to avoid, we're talking about wild caught fish already. You may have seen this image in the top right, a picture of shad next to silver carp. So we've got a terrible issue developing with silver carp in our rivers. And one of the regulations that went in effect in 2021 was prohibiting the transport of water from one watershed to another, and specifically the transport of bait fish. For this problem specifically, it's nearly impossible to identify a silver carp in a batch of threadfin shad and gizzards. So if you go out and you catch a bunch of fish in the river or a lake that has silver carps, it's impossible to ensure that there are no silvers mixed in there. So it's an inconvenient rule, but it's necessary to help slow down the spread of these invasive fish and also plants. So basically, prevention is the best mechanism to keep these dudes out. Mitigation, it kind of goes along with general good pond management. So to keep some of these invasive fish from getting out of control, good water chemistry, good stocking, good habitat, and maintaining a healthy bass population actually helps keep some of these undesirable fish from getting out of control. Gar and bowfin are actually really cool fish. So we've got 4 different species of gar and bowfin in Arkansas. These are ancient species that have been around for millions of years. They are incredibly cool if you have interest in fish, but they're not that great for ponds. So they eat a lot of the forage that we want to go to our bass and our crappies and catfish, and they don't really contribute to the fishing that most people are interested in. Now, bowfin are excellent fighters. They're super fun to catch on bass gear, but they're also not one that's going to get super abundant. So it kind of takes away food from our other better pond fish. And the trouble with these dudes is once they get in there, the only surefire way to get them cleaned out is to drain the pond and restock from scratch. So a prevention, you may have seen in publications about not building ponds on permanent water bodies, so permanent creeks or permanent streams, and making sure that they do not have access to bayous or swamps. If it floods, there's only so much you can do. Your property's next to a swamp. If it floods, it just happens. But if you can design, locate the pond where it has a limited risk of being exposed to surface waters, that will help keep some of these undesirable critters out. So carp and buffaloes can become an issue sometimes. The biggest problem that they raise is they contribute to muddy water. Now, the way that they feed, they're bottom feeders. They kind of graze around on the bottom, and when they basically kick up mud as they go, and it helps to keep ponds muddy. Same thing with the other fish, is prevention is the best mechanism. If you do get a high abundance of these dudes, these are deep-bodied fish, so you can actually use gill nets to catch these out. And gill nets are not terribly expensive, a couple $100 from a manufacturer. I think there's one in Memphis that makes nets. And you can have a perfectly good gill net to help reduce their numbers. It won't get rid of them, but it will help get them out. But what often will happen is you'll need to drain and restock to make sure that they're eradicated. We also have 3 species in Arkansas of bullhead catfish. So these are the short, stocky little catfish with the more rounded tails. They look like a tiny channel catfish that we talk about all the time, but their tails are rounded. The trouble with these dudes is they don't get very big and they don't taste all that good either. So you have to catch a whole mess of them to get fillets reasonable enough to make a dinner out of them. And they also don't taste that great and they can get really abundant. So they're taking away food from a more popular fish. And really the only good solution to get rid of these guys, you do have to drain the pond, restock to get them out in most cases. Now, on very rare occasions, we will get a question about flathead catfish, or really cool fish in its own right, but they can devastate a pond. So flathead catfish get real big. Adults get 40 to 50 pounds fairly quickly, and it takes a lot of food to maintain a fish that large. So what will often happen if somebody introduces flathead catfish is the abundance of other fish, especially your bluegills, and even your sport fish, your bass and your crappies, are going to go into feeding a few of these real big flatheads. So if you want to have flatheads in a pond, you can do it, but you have to understand that it's going to come at the cost of many of your other, especially forage fish, but also some of your sport fish as well. So generally, they're not recommended. Okay, I'm going to talk about stocking rates, and then I'm going to cut it off so that we've got lots of time for Q&A. Our standard stocking rates are conservative. So if you go to a fish farm, even a pond management company, they're probably going to recommend higher stocking rates than what the Extension Service recommends. But ours are conservative deliberately so that you will stock not too many, and they will grow into the carrying capacity of your pond. Ponds can only grow so many pounds of fish per acre, and if you overstock it from the start, they won't grow as fast, they won't reach maximum size, and you'll have to start harvesting them immediately to get them to grow better. So for bass, bluegill, and catfish ponds, the number one thing we're looking for at bass and bluegill is a 10-to-1 ratio of bluegills to bass. So for every one bass, you're putting 10 bluegills in, and we're talking about fingerlings here, so fresh, new stocking. If you want to stock red ear sunfish as a preventative measure for parasites, just kind of mix them into the bluegill rate. So 100 red ears to 400 bluegills to 50 bass per acre, and you'll be in good shape. For channel catfish, 100 or so per acre is perfectly sustainable. Grass carp, we talked about 3 to 5 per acre as being reasonable prevention. And for our forage minnows, fatheads, and golden shiners, 3 to 10 pounds per acre is a perfectly good starting point. All right, so I'm going to shut up for a minute because we can go on forever about this stuff, but let's go to some Q&A. We've got some questions to answer.
All right, perfect. Thank you, Scott. I went ahead and shared one of your links into the chat. Here is the second one, just so I don't forget to do those in a few minutes. So we've got some questions already in the chat, but go ahead, and if you have any more questions, start popping them in there. First question we had was about treble sealing a pond and advice about sheetrock to seal it. Anybody, Wicker, you want to handle that one?
I've seen some people try to do this before. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. My best advice would be if you had access to some really good clay, maybe once you get your, I see another question down here about pond sediment. So once you get your pond drained down and the sediment removed from it and get it back to the original depth that you want, maybe seal it with 1.5 feet or so of clay, 16 to 18 inches of good solid clay, and get that packed in really well. And I've seen that work, and it's you know, it could be a little costly if you don't have access to the clay. If you can tell where it's leaking at and you want to try the sheetrock or the bentonite deal, I've seen people use that too, and it works. So there's several different options there. The bad thing about it, once a pond develops a leak, it's really hard to get that leak to stop, no matter what you use. You may stop it for a short period of time, but it's eventually going to come back most of the time.
Okay. Oh, good job, Scott. Scott's got the screen shared again and a QR code for today's presentation and their website. Also, his email address is there. And so once this gets downloaded, and I'm not going to say we're going to send it out tomorrow, but we'll do a follow-up email, and we can send any kind of links that y'all want, this presentation, contact info, things like that. But we want to have as much information as we can out there to y'all so that you have the resources you need to wisely manage your properties and your ponds. So let's see. How do they get pond water tested to see if fish are safe to eat? Anybody want to jump on that one?
So in most cases, the fish don't really accumulate too much from the water unless you're talking about heavy metals. We've heard the advisements for certain bodies of water when they start accumulating too much of that through bioaccumulation. And in terms of testing the fillets for safety, I don't know of a lab that does it, but what you could do is go to one, you could contact the Arkansas Department for Environmental Quality and ask for one of the labs that could test water for heavy metals. The Arkansas Water Resources Center in Fayetteville can test most parameters. I don't know that they do mercury, but they can test for the other heavy metals and see if anything is too far out of whack. About the only other thing that would accumulate in the fillets that might be noticeable in the fish are the off flavors that you can get from really dense algae blooms. So basically, it's not harmful. It just makes the fish taste kind of muddy. So if you've ever been to a restaurant, you got a catfish that just kind of tastes weird, or some kind of fish that has tasted weird, that was probably from a pond that had a really dense algal bloom, and some of those off flavor residues accumulated in the fats of the fish. So you can have the water tested by any of those labs, and if anything is really far out of whack, then you might see about going and testing for something further in the fish. But in most cases, if it's healthy enough to grow fish, it's probably healthy enough to eat them too.
Yeah, that's a good take on that. Any advice on natural watershed wildlife ponds? We've got a bunch of fish squeezers on this call tonight, but maybe some more detail on what we're looking for in the wildlife pond question. If we're talking about no fish whatsoever, if we're just talking about the creation of one as a water source for wildlife. So if you can clarify that question, we can get to it. Digging on a pond, got about 3 feet deep and hit groundwater. Any suggestions on what to do with that?
That's a tough one. I don't know how big a deal it would be to move a little bit and start over, but once you hit that groundwater, that's a pretty good sign that, well, for one, it's going to be hard to continue construction in that area because everything's going to be muddy and nasty. And then, like you say, once the water level drops, then you're going to deal with a leakage issue. So that's a tough one. Maybe back up and punt on that one and try a different area.
I think we probably covered the mixing bass with channel cat. Scott had a really good slide about the ratios that you're looking for on there. It just, in my opinion, it makes for a healthier environment when you got multiple species in there. Kind of keeps more control and keeps each species in check. So anybody know any possible grants or assistance programs for developing small farm ponds?
Yes, the Natural Resource Conservation Service does have some cost share programs specifically for agricultural purposes. So if it is used for livestock watering or if it's used for irrigation, NRCS definitely could help provide some assistance for that. You'll have to check with them, with your county NRCS conservationist, and see if the pond qualifies. But there absolutely are some grants that can help fund some of the construction costs for those types of ponds. For fishing ponds, forget it. But if it's for ag, yes, there are some programs within RCS that might be able to help.
Yeah. No. We have a question about grass carp introduction in a good pond, removing the necessary cover for newly spawned fish.
Yeah, that's certainly one that, you know, if you've got grass, it's already in there, they're certainly going to consume that and may cause some recruitment issues, but there's some pretty easy ways around that. Christmas trees and cedar trees are readily available for most times during certain times of the year. A good pile of Christmas trees provides a pretty good dense habitat for these younger fish. Outside of that, other trees are also good, tree tops. But you can also go the synthetic route as well. PVC habitats work well. There are some companies that you can actually make or buy rather very small grass, basically synthetic grass to put in your pond that would kind of imitate that. Basically, you just want as many interstitial spaces as you can get that give them opportunities to hide. So yes, they are going to eat up the cover, but that doesn't mean that you're out of the ballpark. You can very much add cover back in that's not grass related and still maintain what you've got.
Thank you, sir. I think we got a question asking for a list of fish stockers in North Arkansas. So Arkansas Game and Fish does not stock private ponds, but I will share a link. Scott may have a more updated copy than I do, but we will put that in that follow-up email with a list of the fish stockers in Arkansas. My copy is 10 plus years old. I don't know if we have a more current one.
So all the same publication you're talking about is outdated. We're working on a revision now with the new certification program with the AGFC. We're going to have more updated information. So hopefully by next year, we'll have an updated list. I do have that on the UAPB pond management website. If you follow the links or that QR code on the bottom right and go to the additional resources page and scroll down, you'll find that in the fish section.
Thank you, sir. Too many grass carp in a pond. I mean, yeah, if it's your primary species, I'd say that's probably too many. Kind of like the slide that Scott had. Five grass carp is probably going to be an ample number to start with when you're stocking per acre. Yeah, five in any amount of acres. I don't care.
Yeah, there was also a question about, is muddy water better for controlling vegetation? Actually, yes. So if you have to choose between a 2-foot deep pond that's covered in weeds or a 2-foot deep pond that's just muddy and kind of ugly, the muddy pond might actually be the better option. They're a little easier to manage anyway.
And that's often what happens when you have too many grass carp is you end up, they are rooting around, they're starving, trying to find something to eat. They end up keeping the water pretty stirred up. So that's definitely something to keep into consideration. Like Scott said, if you kind of need that muddy pond, having too many carp will help that. But we typically don't recommend folks to overstock carp. It usually causes more problems than it does good.
Okay, we got two tricky, well, we'll say tricky. They're convoluted or can be. General rule of thumb on when, how to keep fish and remove from the pond, which I think feeds right into that next question. They've got 1 5-pound bass in there, but their typical catch is 1 to 2 pounds, and they're looking for a harvest rate to grow the smaller fish. So I think that's a 2-for-1 right there.
Sure. So the second half of this presentation, you go and download it. We talk a little bit about that. So harvest rates in general, just across the board, we talk about 10 to 15 pounds per acre per year of largemouth bass harvest, and focus most of that harvest on fish smaller than about 12, 13 inches or so. If you've got a whole bunch of small ones, harvest more. So if you feel like you're catching lots and lots of bass, it's easy to get them and they're all 10 to 12 inches and they've got big heads and skinny bodies, harvest up to 35 pounds per acre per year and keep that up until you start seeing improvement. On bluegills, The general recommendation in the texts suggests up to 50 pounds per acre per year of fish larger than 5 inches. I'm coming to believe that that is too much, especially for small ponds. You can overfish a bluegill population in a small pond. What I'm starting to recommend more often is 25 pounds per acre per year of bluegills less than 7 inches in length. And the idea is you've got a wide range of fish big enough to catch with rod and reel, but you are protecting the large bluegills that will serve as your brood stock. So same thing with them. If they are overabundant, you can harvest as many as you can catch. You can use bluegill traps baited with bread in a little basket. You could use seine nets through the spawning areas to remove a really high abundance of bluegills quickly. You could also stock more sport fish, more predators to try to crop them off a little faster. So in a lot of cases, if you've got a pond that's kind of out of whack, you've got one big bass and a bunch of kind of runts, it might take a little bit more investigation from a pro to not only look at the fish, but let's talk about chemistry. Let's talk about habitat. Let's talk about the layout of the pond, that fertility too, that may be playing into why the fishery is a little bit out of whack.
Okay. I've seen a couple of questions involving vegetation. We'll come back to those if we have time. If not, those will definitely be covered in the second part of this series. So cedar trees good for a pond. I think Micah covered on that when he was talking about that being a good option. If you are introducing grass carp, that's something that they're not going to take up, and it's great structure for small fish. Lime and fertilize. Let's see, I need to lime and fertilize my pond. Do I need to be concerned about runoff into, oh, okay. So are we liming and fertilizing a field is maybe what we're looking at, and being concerned about the runoff into the pond, maybe is the way that's trying to be read.
Right. So typically in fields that require lime, typically the ponds are going to need it as well. And you usually have to get the lime in there before the fertilizer, so the fertilizer will actually respond. And typically bare minimum is a month, but it can take several months for that lime to really incorporate into the soil and start changing the chemistry of the water. So typically we recommend that lime goes in the fall to winter, and then you can start your fertilization program when the water starts getting into the mid 60s. So in terms of runoff, your pond is a reflection of the soil underneath it and the soil that's feeding it. So if you've got really acidic soil around it and you lime the pond only, it's a matter of time before you'll need to reapply that lime to keep the fertility where you want it. So typically 5 to 7 years after liming is typically when you'll need to relime again.
It's a valid point. As far as book recommendations for pond design, I don't know that we have any of those. Scott, you got any thoughts on that, Micah?
The Natural Resources Conservation Service has a publication, NRCS 590. It's on the pond website as well. It's not so much a layout, like just kind of designing cool fish ponds. It's more of the technical, how do I build a pond that doesn't leak? But it does come with some recommendations on layout and design. And you can speak with fisheries biologists with the state or a private pond company, and they can help sit down with your dirt mover and come up with a design that'll be good for the fish and look nice too.
And like I mentioned earlier, shoreline is one of the most important things. I sketched out something real quickly for the other guy. A guy the other day, he ended up losing an acre or two in his pond by the time I got done doing some sketching, but he gained like 600 yards of shoreline. And so, don't get tied up on acreage being the important. It's really that shoreline that's going to drive a lot of your productivity. So any recommendations in the design, in my opinion, need to include as much shoreline as possible.
Okay, are turtles detrimental? There are 12 turtles in a pond. Micah, go ahead and answer it.
No, I mean, they're just a part of the natural ecosystem. I mean, they're going to eat fish and vegetation, but there's certainly those fish and turtles have been cohabitating since the beginning of time. So no, they're not going to cause any issues.
Good spawning habitat for catfish. Tires was the one in question. That's an option. Wicker, you got any other?
Yeah, I mean, they're cavity spawners, so any kind of nook and cranny they can get into. A lot of people put boxes out. We use here at the hatchery, we use old 10-gallon milk cans for our catfish to spawn in. They really like those. So just anything that you can put in there, you know, stack some pallets up, whatever, they'll use it.
And I think I would add to that too would be, why would you want catfish to spawn in your pond? Sometimes they have the ability to really over produce, and you end up with the same concept that Scott talked about with stunted crappie. You get the same concept with catfish as well. One of the easiest recommendations that we make a lot is, you know, if you have a small pond and you put in 200 fish, after a couple of years, you begin to harvesting 50, 7,500 fish. You know, it's time to go ahead and add a few more fish. And if you keep adding fish every couple of years, it's easy on the pocketbook, but it also helps you maintain your population. And you don't have to worry about them getting out of hand with the stunting.
Grass carp contributing to muddy water like other carp do. Okay.
Not as
Micah got
much
that.
as common carp, but they certainly can.
Yeah. Okay. Will catfish eat sunfish if not fed enough?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes. Removal rates for crappie.
From what I've seen in the ponds and small lakes where the crappie did really well, it was harvest every single crappie you catch. Now, these are ponds that are fertile, so they've got lots of reproduction and lots of recruitment. And in a lot of cases, these are ponds that also have good bass, big sizes and numbers. But I'm seeing really, really high harvest rates of crappie from fertile ponds and lakes, and they're able to support it. So if you've got the habitat and the forage and the fertility, you can harvest very aggressively on crappie.
Yeah. Last question we have here is about recommending a company to manage ponds for clients. Scott, you got anything there?
There are 2 Arkansas-based companies operating right now. The one out of Lone Oak is Aquatic Resources Consulting, and the one out of Lake Village is Sunrise Fisheries. Both of those are comprehensive pond management companies. They can do everything from vegetation, fish stocking, electrofishing. They can do it all. Now, the only company that can do liming is the Aquatic Resource Consulting out of Lone Oak. So if you need liming, they're the only one in the state that can do it. We do get serviced by the major regional and national companies in Texas and Alabama and nearby, but you're going to have to pay for their travel costs. So generally, you'll get a better deal by dealing with one of the Arkansas-based companies.
Gotcha. Thank you, sir. So we did get clarification on the the watershed pond, and it's managing for wildlife. So if the issue is that it's not holding water well because it is a natural watershed, I mean, that's just kind of Mother Nature's taking care of it. You know, there's not a lot that can be done unless you're going to try to find a way to invest in piping water to it. There's fish in it, so that's not really the issue, but wildlife are pretty resilient, and they're going to find that water. And when it's dry, it's dry, and that's just kind of the way it works sometimes. Yeah. Anybody got any other comments to that?
I would suggest just maintaining vegetation diversity. So there are a handful of swampy or wet ground plants that you could introduce to help just increase diversity and actually do some aesthetics. So like pickerel weed, the arrowheads, there's a handful of them that are pretty nice. The more native irises, things like that. There is a publication out of Texas Parks and Wildlife that talks about shoreline plants, mainly for soil stabilization, but it also could be in this discussion for habitat diversity for wildlife and insects as well. I don't remember the number on that, but if you Google Texas Parks and Wildlife shoreline aquatic plants, I think you'll be able to find it. I can't recall what it is right now.
Thank you,
And
sir.
those types of plants around a shoreline too also make the wildlife feel a lot safer. Anytime you have a bush hog mowed landscape pond, they're always pretty skittish because they really don't have a place to hide. So having some cover in and around a wildlife pond is going to make them feel much more comfortable when they're coming in to get a drink.
Very good. We're coming up at 1 hour right now. Got one more question here. If y'all got any questions, please throw them in the chat. I do want to thank everybody for joining us tonight and remind them about September 6th being the second part of this, where we'll talk more about the vegetation involved. It's a pretty deep topic for this, and I think we can literally, pun intended, get into the weeds on that pretty easily. Are there ways to use a fish pond to increase agricultural productivity through irrigation and utilizing floodplains?
Yes.
Anybody?
Yes.
Yeah, so that would be, you'd get better technical guidance from NRCS because they are engineers specifically trained to do that sort of thing. So I would check with them about if you have a pond already built, what its utility would be for irrigation, because not all ponds are going to be suited for it. But they could make a site visit and see if it is suitable for that purpose, hopefully by gravity, but if not, perhaps by pumping. What troubles you'll typically run into with irrigation ponds is, especially right now, is when you need the water. So you're going to have lower water levels, higher water temperatures. So some of the species, like crappie, do not handle higher temperatures very well, and it might make them more prone to sickness, diseases, disease outbreaks. So it's something to consider, but absolutely, if you've got a pond, it can be used for irrigation and you can still have good fishing in it. It just depends on how it's laid out.
Okay. Let's see. I guess I'll go with this last question over the two involving vegetation. Like I said, those vegetation questions, one was algae, one was duckweed. They can definitely be tricky, and I think we'll be better suited to try to touch on those when we get to part 2 of this. But the last question we have is enticing ducks and geese to land. And if we want to touch on that for a second, we can, and then we'll go ahead and start wrapping things up.
I think one of the biggest things is it's hard to effectively manage for both. If you want a fish pond, it's best to have a fish pond. If you want to have a duck pond, it's best to have a duck pond. Because the things that typically go with waterfowl ponds, you're going to look at high coverages of vegetation, lots of varieties. You're probably going to want to do a lot of water drawdowns to help manage your vegetation stands. And all of those, not that they can't coincide, but when you're talking about drawing ponds down and having too much vegetation, one, it's going to be hard on your fish. And two, if you have fish, most of the time you can't get to them because of the vegetation need that you have, or the vegetation desires that you're going to have for your waterfowl. So a lot of the recommendation we give to folks is pick one or the other. Try to go either fish or waterfowl, and there's very much different implications for those.
All right. Well, I definitely want to thank our panel tonight. We had a lot of great information, and I truly appreciate y'all giving up part of your evening to help everybody out. And I want to thank all of our participants for some really good questions that I think is really going to help people in their management of their property. So please join us on September 6th. Tara has put a link to registering for that in the chat, and we'll also put one of those in the follow-up email that's coming soon. So with that, I think we're going to sign off, and we appreciate everybody for their time. Thank y'all.